Hey, what's up? Gleb Alexandrov here for CreativeShrimp.com. Today we'll be creating ripples in Blender. We'll be talking about how you can create this kind of ripple effect seen in the teaser of my video course called Realistic Lighting in Blender, 11 hacks you've probably never tried. And actually you can use this technique to create any kind of, well, ripples. And ripples not only on the planar surfaces, but on any kind of surface like this spherical balloon. Alright, as usual, it all starts with a plane. So let's create the plane first. Open Blender. I guess you've done it already. Then create a plane, press W and select Subdivide. And let's repeat the process a few more times by pressing Shift R. And now we have a pretty dense mesh as 66,000 polygons. Let's move on to the next step. Add the Waves modifier. Okay, so navigate to the Modifiers tab and select the Wave modifier. Another easy step. And now if you press play on the animation panel, you'll see how this modifier works. Basically, it creates ripples. Surprise! And to better see the effect, let's open the right panel by hitting N and select the black mud cap. Also, I'm gonna open the left panel by pressing T and select the smooth shading. You know, for the sake of smoothness. And I should say that we'll be using this modifier only in conjunction with the particle system that will trigger the waves. So for now, it's not very interesting for us to tweak the settings of the modifier itself. But if you like, you can play with the settings and see how it all works. For example, you can tweak the speed of it and watch how it gets slower. But let's move on to the next step, much more interesting. And that step is to play with the dynamic paint. We need a canvas and a brush. I created a sphere to serve as a brush. So go to Physics, click on Dynamic Paint and select the brush. Then just click on the Add Brush and leave all other settings intact. And now let's select the plane. That will be our canvas. So I'm gonna reset the ripples settings in the Modifier tab. Then I'm gonna add the Dynamic Paint to it, add canvas. And next I'm gonna change the surface type. Right now it's set to paint, but we want it to be waves. Because we wanted to communicate with the Waves modifier. I pressed play, and as I'm dragging this sphere around, you can see how it interacts with the canvas. I think that looks very cool, like a fluid simulation. That's very easy to achieve. Let's add the particle system that will trigger these effects. Before we do it, I'll spend a moment and tweak the settings of the canvas. If you lower the speed, you'll get this substance much more like an oil. It will look like a liquid with a high viscosity value. And if you crank up the spring value, it will get even more jelly-like. But actually, I want it to have a watery look, so I'm gonna reset the spring, the smoothness, damping, and the speed to their initial values. And I'm gonna create the particle system by going to the Particles tab and hitting New. Right away, let's rename it to Rain to keep it organized. And now if you press Alt-A, you can see that it works. And it's always a very pleasant feeling when it just works. Okay, so I've set the number of the particles to 100 because I don't want it to be so rainy. Also, I've brought up the lifetime to make sure that every particle lives just enough to hit the plane. Now let's select our rain particle system in the paint source rollout for the brush. And ta-da, that works as well, and we get ripples. And I love this effect, it's almost real time and it looks great. Now I'm gonna crank up the damping value, because I don't want the ripples to reach the edges of the plane. Because we'll be baking this effect to texture, and we don't want it to have a visible seams. That would be a nightmare. Now I'm gonna set the speed to 0.4, because I think the effect was a little bit too fast. Okay, also I'm gonna crank up the solid radius to make a more pronounced effect. And the next step is to render the ripples textures. But before doing it, let's take a moment and subdivide the plane one more time. Press W and subdivide, and to get a really high res, really detailed texture, we need to have a sufficient number of polygons in place. Chances are, after that operation your computer will explode, or probably will get a little bit slower, but that's fine. Okay, let's get to the camera view and set the resolution to 2048 on both sides to create a square texture later on. Let's reset the rotation on the camera to make it point down. Here you can see me positioning the camera so it encompasses the plane. And the sphere of the particle emitter should be invisible when we render the whole thing. So let's jump to the cycle settings and disable the visibility of the diffuse, glossy and all other rays. Also I'm gonna set the minimum and maximum number of bounces to 0 to make it faster. And I'm gonna enter the rendered viewport mode. Right now we can see just the gray plane. That's boring. Let's go to the node editor and add the geometry node. And right away, let's hit Shift A and add the normal node. Drag the normal output over here and the dot into the color slot of the diffuse shader. Now when I rotate the trackball, we can see how the viewport changes. Basically, what we do here, we try to visualize the direction of the surface normals. Okay, I'm adding the color ramp node, and what I want to do is to crank up the contrast a bit. That will work really well for a displacement texture, I think. Let's render it out. Let's set the output first. Ripple, sequence, accept. And then just hit render animation. And that will do it. And probably it will take some time to render. And you can span it however you like. You can watch some more tutorials on Creative Shrimp, for example. Okay, let's create a mask for the ripples. And that is one of the scenes from the realistic lighting video course. And it features this road texture. What I'm gonna do here is to use this bright spot on the texture as a mask. Of course, you can paint the mask by hand, but in this case, it's much easier to just tweak the initial texture. What I'll do now is create a separate shader for puddle. Drag it over here and assign the bright color, yellow for example, so we can preview it very clearly. And then let's plug the road image texture into the mix factor. But we need somehow to isolate the bright spot on the texture. For that reason, let's add the color ramp and boost the contrast. Essentially, it will allow us to leave only the area with the puddle. And that's precisely what we need, because where the texture is white, the water material will be revealed. And now let's create a water shader. And actually, I replaced the yellow color with more pleasant one, because for some reason, I don't quite like the yellow puddles. And I'm gonna add the UV map and selecting our first and single UV map and plug it into the vector input of the image shader. Let's choose a black color in the diffuse shader. That will symbolize the asphalt beneath the water. And also I want to mix it with the glossy shader. That will be our water. Connect it to the mix shader, and as a mix factor, I'm going to use the Fresnel node, because water gets reflective at a sharper angle. Now set the roughness to 0 to make it perfectly glossy. Alright, perfect. And now we need to import the sequence that we've rendered and position it using the second UV map. Press Shift A, select Texture, Image Sequence. Navigate to the folder with your sequence, press A to select all the files. Okay, after that set it to cyclic and auto-refresh, so we could see the effect right in the viewport. Now what I did, I pressed Ctrl Shift to preview the node, and you need to have the node Wrangler add-on enabled. And when I press play, you can see that our texture is indeed animated. That's a moving pictures, woo. I'm gonna create the second UV map. In a moment we'll need it to position the ripples and not mess the original UV map that is used for the road texture, obviously. So let's create the UV map node and select the second UV map, plug it into the image sequence. And what I'm gonna do now is open the UV image editor, select the sequence, press N to open the right tab, and set the number of frames to 250. Now we need to unwrap the plane. So with the second UV map selected in the UV Maps tab, navigate to the top view, then press U and select Project from View. Oh, it's a rhyme going on here. Okay, let's position it so the ripple should be where it should be, where the puddle is, I guess. And you can do it by moving the UV islands around and let there be bump or the normal mapping as you wish. Add the bump node, connect the image sequence to the height input, and connect the normal to the glossy shader normal input. After that, I'm going to press Ctrl Shift and click on the mix shader. And by the way, did you see my cat? It's such a lovely bastard, I should say. Okay, let's get back to our scene, and now we have bump map in place. Hit play to preview the animation, and it already looks very convincing. If you want to tweak the position of the ripples, just create the mapping node and tweak the location parameters. If you wanted to make it a little bit smaller, crank up the scale. And as you do it, you may notice that your texture got tiled. It's a normal behavior, but if you don't want it to tile, you can enable the minimum and maximum checkboxes in the mapping node. In other words, after enabling these checkboxes, only one instance of that texture will be displayed. There will be no tiling effect, but I don't care. In this particular case, that is more than okay. Right now the reflection is slightly unimpressive and dull, and what can we do to enhance it? We can provide something interesting to reflect. So I'll just do the usual trick. I'll create the plane, rotate it, position it so it covers the background, and name it background. I have this lovely texture of the night city. To assign it to the plane, I'm gonna unwrap it first by hitting U and selecting unwrap. Then I'm gonna go to the node editor, delete the shader, create the emission shader, and assign this texture to the emission shader color input. Usual business. How many times do we do this stuff during our artists' lives? I don't know. And one of the principles of coding is don't repeat yourself. Alright, we got a nice reflection in the puddle, but we need to tweak the saturation and the value to make it less pronounced, because it looked like it doesn't belong to the scene. And now it looks much better. And probably the last thing I'll do in this tutorial is I'll crank up the distance of the bump shader. That will give us essentially very believable ripples effect. One more trick for you so you can easily preview it in the viewport. By default, the start resolution is set to 64, and that means that the preview is very noisy when you press Alt-A. I'm usually setting it to 512, and it provides a very smooth viewport. And as I've said earlier, you can use this effect in very creative ways, like for making the ripples, or maybe a ripple in water. Okay, anyway, thanks for your interest and support, and check out the new video course, Realistic Lighting in Blender. You can find it on creativeshrimp.com. And my name is Gleb Alexandrov. We will see you the next time.